supported as citizens and ordinary taxpayers and ordinary people bring their own power democratically to bear on the government that is putting the interests of bondholders and bankers before the interests of the majority and the interests of society. Therefore, the boycott of that odious so-called property tax, a tax on the individual and the family home, should be absolutely supported, along with political pressure to force the government to relent in regard to this tax.
Sorry, Deputy, I'm going to ask you to call the adjournment, and you'll have 4 minutes left then when it's
okay. Mulim alone at all immersion.
Okay. Thank you. We're now moving to private members' business. Speaker is Deputy John Collins. Deputy, sorry, I understand you're sharing your time.
Deputy Murphy, Fleming, Boyd Barrett and McGrath.
Okay, is that agreed? Agreed, okay.
Okay, thank you. Generally supporting the private members' bill. I have a bill in the lottery that, in my opinion, would be a real solution for ordinary homeowners with distressed mortgages. Hopefully that will come up fairly soon. I want to speak on a specific related issue, though, because I think it's an important one. And it's a serious effects many people have at the moment, receiving little or no attention or publicity, and it's a shared ownership scheme. It was introduced in the property boom to help people who couldn't get mortgages in the private market, and was operated by the local authorities. Whilst the scheme may have been useful in the period of huge inflation of property prices, it has now turned into a negative equity nightmare. It's a noose around the necks of many young people and couples who cannot get out of the trap that they find themselves in. A discussion paper developed in Dublin City Council in 2011 has identified 5 major areas. And I think Dublin City Council has about 2,900 loans in relation to the shared ownership. One was the negative equity loans, outstanding far in excess of market value, and borrowers can't pay the mortgage. 2, people whose accommodation needs have changed, are having young children, 1, 2 or 3 children over the last period of time. 3, purchasers coming to the end of their mortgage who cannot discharge negative equity, and people who want to surrender their home because of antisocial behaviour, and then purchasers who want to rent out. There is no legislative framework in place to allow the council to deal with this problem. I think this is a very, very important issue. They cannot write down it needs legislation, and the government has to act on this issue. In Dublin City Council, it's a higher proportion of these loans. It's a high level of arrears. Government has to take action, and I'm working with a campaign group around these issues and to campaign for the government to write these down. So I hope the Minister is listening there. Are you listening?
Yeah. I'd like to welcome this motion, and I want to focus on two areas in a very short time that's available to me. One is in relation to the mortgage debt resolution, or so-called resolution. Just want to give you an example of a couple who that I'm dealing with, who entered into the scheme with Ulster Bank in February 2012. They disclosed all and were eventually offered an interest-only option for 12 months. Unfortunately, things deteriorated both from an income and a health point of view. Several months ago, they began attempts to talk to the bank because the 12 months were just about up. Despite their best efforts, they are being given the runaround. I made inquiries with the central bank, who advised that they should make a formal complaint to Ulster Bank, who have then ignored them. I've advised them now that they can now complain to the Ombudsman. These people are stressed out. Some banks are not genuine about the process, and they need to be called out. This is not working, and some of the banks are not working this mortgage scheme. The second issue I want to raise is the issue of those on the housing waiting list. In Kildare, there's more than 7,000 on our lists. The 6 worst counties in the country account for 43% of the national waiting list. The 4 Dublin local authorities, Cork City and Kildare, are the 6. The bottom 6 counties account for less than 5% of the national waiting list, so a targeted approach to the problem is urgently needed, because there isn't overhang and there won't be NAM properties in most of these. There are 4,338 families in receipt of rent assistance in Kildare, which is the third highest nationally after Dublin and Cork. The levels of rent assistance are so far below the market rents in Kildare, and particularly in the towns of North Kildare that have a Dublin focus, that they're in real difficulty. An exception was made for some of the Wicklow towns, like Bray and Greystones, but none for Kildare. The result is that people, practically everyone, is topping up their rent from their welfare. They're going without food, they're not paying their utility bills, and otherwise, if they didn't do that, they would face the streets, many of them having to take their children out of school. The government needs to begin taking these issues seriously, and really what they need to produce is practical solutions rather than spin.
Thank you. Deputy Finian McGrath, or Deputy Fleming, sorry.
Fiona Muldoon, the head of the banking supervision of the Central Bank, she addressed bankers' conference on the 16th of October last, and I believe that she put her fingers on the pulse when she quite bluntly asked the banks to address the mortgage mess that they created. She warned of a lack of leadership in the sector, as she revealed that 167,000 loans, residential and buy-to-let, which with a total of 135 million were in arrears at that particular time. Some of the immediate action needed to rectify the banking economy is a realistic approach to the chronic arrears issue. And with some of the debt written off, long-term solutions for others, and an acceptance of the reality of arrears. The problem of negative equity and personal solvency is having a devastating effect on consumer confidence, spending, job creation and tax returns are spiralling downwards. And today's news again that the Allied Irish Banks is planning a new increase in the variable rates will no doubt be followed on by all lenders in the market in a very short time.
1 minute.
The property tax is being introduced at the worst possible time for the householder. I do believe that there's an immediate need to put it definitely at a minimum on hold, and at least for those who bought between 2001 and 2008 have received a rebate in stamp duty until the normal lending levels have been restored to the market. This would minimise negative equity, repair household balances sheets, minimise personal insolvency and get a sizable number of people spending again. Just to get back to the Fiona Muldoon, the banking supervisor of the Central Bank, I'll quote from her. I think she was really dealing with the real situation here with the banks. Meanwhile, the misery of personal indebtedness that is unsustainable for so many people must be meaningfully dealt with. This is the size of the task and enormous difficulty of it. This is the needle to tread over the coming years. And this is what we'll all face. And I also want to tell you what I found since I came to Irish banking. My experience is not necessarily of an industry humbled.
Thank you.
Success is about finding solutions. Why the need to still talk of being humble 4 years on. Does it strike anyone else a bit of sackcloth and ashes and a little penitential is what we still require? I'm not sure. She said, when I deal with the banks, I have not found humility.
Thank
if
you.
the bank industry is grieving for the debt of the economy and the mistakes of the past, I know which stage of grief it looks like to me. Unquote.
Deputy McGrath.
Colleague, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of speaking to this private member's motion on mortgages, the major distress to families and the whole issue of housing. This time bomb is about to explode and we need to be ready for it. We also have to be on our guard following the promissory note deal on the issue of Article 123 of the Lisbon Treaty and Germany's central bank's concerns. I hope this government is up early in the morning dealing with a huge potential crisis. If we do not get real burden sharing in the European Union and better debt resolution, it will blow this economy out of the water with major consequences for our citizens, and particularly in this debate tonight on household arrears and debt. You can never say that you weren't warned, Minister, and the reality is now on the ground that 1 in 4 mortgage holders in this state is in distress, while tens of thousands more are at risk of distress. 115 mortgage holders are falling into distress every single day. The government have failed to fully implement the recommendations of the report of the Interdepartmental Mortgage Arrears Working Group, the Keane report, in the mortgage crisis. The central bank and the financial institutions are failing to be proactive. The personal insolvency legislation will do little for the vast majority of mortgage holders. We need to face up to these facts and support families in need and not destroy family life in Ireland. Finally, I urge the deputies to support the motion tonight as it offers solutions. We need to remove the veto to lenders over proposed insolvency agreements in the Personal Insolvency Act 2012 and prioritise the maintenance of the family home in any agreements dealing with residential mortgages. But we also need to provide the legislation for an independent education and enforcement on the mortgage distress cases. Take more direct action with the central bank to force lending institutions and ensure that NAMA contributes to the social and economic development of the state in providing any housing units in its portfolio suitable for social housing.
Deputy Boyd Barrett, 2 minutes.
Minister, the crisis of mortgage distress is a disaster that is going to very soon turn into a catastrophe. We have over 160,000 families who are absolutely suffocated with this unsustainable debt burden, and that number is rising by about 800 every week. And nothing has been done. After 2 years in government, there is no let-up on the deepening of this crisis. And you refuse, for reasons I simply cannot understand, to assert the control that you have over these banks that we bailed out and where you are the major shareholder, to simply tell them to sort this problem out by writing off unsustainable debt.
1 minute.
Our economy is being utterly suffocated. It's not just the enormous distress and anxiety that the families directly affected are going through, but the entire economy is being suffocated because of this problem. And if you are the major shareholder in these banks and we have bailed them out, why can you not simply tell them to write off this debt or restructure these debts in a sustainable way? It's simply inexplicable. I'm just finishing this, Count Corla. I went with a family who have distressed mortgages to AIB last week, and they accepted it was unsustainable, something should be done, but couldn't tell us what it would be, and said something, muttered something about long-term forbearance. And then they said, unbelievably, 3 times during the course of the meeting, they said, but you might win the lotto. You might win the lotto over the next few years. Now, is our policy for dealing with mortgage distress, or for the effect that it's having on the economy, hoping that the country wins the lotto, or that all the people in mortgage distress win the lotto? They're not going to win the lotto. You need to make the banks do the right thing and sort this problem out.
Thank you, Deputy. Now move to the...
Clarification. When I asked the Minister, was he listening, can you clarify that you replied that there wasn't much to listen to?
I wasn't here in the chair at that stage. I don't know what transpired.
I'm sure it's going to be on the record, but I'll pass it on to the share ownership people who are in distress at the moment.
I think...
Talking there yourself when everyone else was speaking, so you did. You didn't do much listening.
Sorry, Minister, sorry.
I'll pass it on.
You didn't do much listening.
I'll pass it on.
Minister, we're moving on. I've just taken over the chair.
Listen to your colleagues.
Sorry, Minister, please. We're moving on now, please. Deputy Catherine Byrne, 3 minutes.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have a few minutes to speak on this. I believe one of the legacies of the previous government is the mortgage arrears crisis. They led a charge with their many developer friends and the bankers that they knew at the time, and it is crippling a lot of young couples out there today, and particularly many family and friends of all of us who are here. We all know someone in mortgage distress and know too well the stressful situation it is on a daily basis for them. I'm particularly concerned about the young people who at the time bought into their dream home and now have been left tied with this property around their neck. I also can give a couple of examples of young people who weren't together before when they bought as single people, and now they are in love and are living together, and they're trying to deal with 2 mortgages, and it's become a very stressful situation for a lot of them. The government is making strides, and the Personal Insolvency Reform Bill is one step in the right direction, I believe. It will give an opportunity to some, not everybody, but some, to be able to have some pressure taken off them. And I think that's a welcome opportunity for everybody. I think the experience of being in mortgage debt and not being able to pay your bills is a very stressful one, but it's one that everybody in this country is dealing with at this time. And it is very hard times for everybody, and we have to feel that, what we're doing here is making a better future for our children into the years to come. Can I just say a short thing about social housing? I believe the impact on social housing has been the many people who've had to give back their keys and walk into the City Council offices and put their names down on a list to be able to prevail. I really don't understand driving through my constituents, the many empty apartments that's left there. And I do welcome Minister Jan O'Sullivan looking at identifying 400 apartments and houses through NAMI that may be able to be put back into the role of having social housing for people outside. Now, just end on regeneration boards and projects, of which I was a member of since 1999 when I served on many of them. And of course, some of them were developed, like Falliman Mansions, Bridge House and Bridgeford Street. And they're great projects. They've added a wonderful significance to the inner city. But the ones who lost out were like St Michael's Estate, Dolphin House, and other many, like Teresa's Gardens. I know we can blame public representatives that these didn't go through and everything else, but I think communities have to take responsibility here. I think particularly in my case, and I spent many years on these boards, community organisations need to take responsibility why PPPs weren't carried out. We're 6 weeks away from signing an agreement on a board to have a development happen in my own constituency. And the plug was pulled by community organisations, not by the political parties, not by the people living in the estates, but by community organisations. And there has to be some responsibility taken by them now that some of the developments haven't gone through. And the fact now we're hit with a crisis that there's so many people needing to go on the social housing list.
Thank you, Deputy. Call now on Deputy Michelle Mulheron. You have 3 minutes. I'll let you know when there's one left.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm also pleased to be able to speak on this tonight. I think one truth has to be told here about debt is there is no easy way to deal with debt, and when you're up to your tonsils in debt and it's over your head, it's never going to be easy. So we're tasked with finding mechanisms, bearing in mind all the, I suppose, legalities and complications of the person who owes and the person who is owed money and what that means in reality. But we have to be compassionate, and I believe that the introduction of personal insolvency legislation, one of the main tenors of it, is to say to people that you are worth more than your debt. And there is a way to deal with debt. It doesn't mean there's a magic wand. There is no magic wand for the problems we have in this country, and we have been dealing with them bit by bit and making progress. I think it has to be acknowledged, progress that has been made, whether it's from the stabilisation of the banks, the dreaded banks and all the rest. But we need banks. And the personal insolvency bill, the work that the central bank has carried out towards obtaining mortgage arrears resolution processes between the banks and lenders. Now, I think the banks are required to take a long, hard look at a situation where people are being put out of their house, handing over their keys, and still have a house they pay $200,000 for, worth $40,000, and they're still paying the rest of the debt. It's totally unsustainable. People will be crushed under the pressure of that. And that's a wake-up call for banks. And I know recently a number of myself and colleagues met with the CEO of the AIB, and I'm very impressed about their plans this year to deal with each and every loan that is in difficulty from the point of view of restructuring in a sustainable way, whether it's extending out, and I suggest extending out loans to 40 years, whatever it takes. We are in quite desperate times, and people want some solutions that they can grasp onto, and we have to be imaginative and innovative about it. I'd like to just speak to the issue of, I just think this, I suppose I can just speak for where I'm from and the general region, but to me, the idea that we're going to embark on building more social housing is absolutely crazy. The fact of the matter is, and it should be remembered, that people who are on social housing lists, council housing lists at the moment, are actually in accommodation at the moment. And that accommodation is required to be up to a certain standard. And there are people who have landlords who are renting it to, whether the state is paying most of the rent or whether people are paying rent themselves. And we build more houses, we put people into those council houses, and we have empty properties besides landlords who have mortgages who cannot pay them. And they were encouraged to build and rent and all the rest. So building more houses is definitely not a solution. And as I say, particularly in relation to where I'm from myself, it is actually a ridiculous proposal.
Thank you, Deputy. Call now on Deputy Anthony Lawler. 3 minutes. I'll let you know when there's one to go.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's ironic that we're here debating a motion from Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin are looking for a Truth and Reconciliation Board up the north of Ireland. I wish they would come in here and tell the truth at certain stages. I'm speaking specifically with regard to Deputy Ferris yesterday, who came in and quoted a lot of figures. And when he said, when he added up all the figures, there was over 200,000 people awaiting accommodation in this state. The reality of the situation, there are 98,000, unfortunately, there are 98,000 people on the housing list in the various local authorities around the county. That number has mushroomed over the last number of years. But may I say that it is strange that Sinn Féin come in here and preach to us about how we should be looking after the housing of our people here in this state. And up the north of Ireland, they are in power. Up the north of Ireland, they are on the Housing Authority. They have councillors on the Housing Authority. And up the north of Ireland, there are 36,000 people looking for houses in the 6 counties of the north of Ireland. Proportionately, that is the same number. Proportionally, that is the same as the number of people looking for housing down here. Why should Sinn Féin come in here and lecture us as to what we should do with regard to social housing when they are not looking after the people in the north of Ireland where they are in power? Let me come to another point with regard that was brought up by one of the deputies yesterday, speaking with regard to NAMA. NAMA have approximately 4,000 houses that are available for social housing throughout the whole of the country. The thing about that is that we must get our local authorities to actively engage with NAMA. I know in my own county, in Kildare, 227 properties were made available to the local authorities in Kildare. To date, only 4 have actually been delivered.
1 minute.
43 are actually being contracted to be completed with the local authorities, and a further 48 properties are actively under negotiation. It is vitally important that we as public representatives encourage our local authorities to actively engage with NAMA, because NAMA are willing to put those properties available for social housing, so as we can remove the number of people, the 98,000 that are on the list here in this country. But it is ironic that Sinn Féin should come in here and lecture to us about how we should look after our social housing needs, when in actual fact they are in power in the north of Ireland and they don't care about the people up there.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Ciarán Lynch, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And if I could begin by just commending Sinn Féin on bringing forward this motion this evening. It is a very, very important issue. It is necessary that the House debate it, and I just wish to acknowledge that Sinn Féin, by bringing this private member's time before the House this evening, allows members of the House to address it. However, in looking at the Sinn Féin motion, Chairperson, there's 2 issues that jump off, well, 3 issues that jump off the page to me. One is there's no mention of homelessness in the 2 pages of the motion, which is a degree unfortunate. Considering that it is a very important issue, and that Minister O'Sullivan's department has actually been very, very robust in this area in protecting the homelessness budget to date. And in my own city, we see 2 new homeless units actually being given sanction for further development, both with the Simon Community and with Fellowship House. But the 2 items I want to address in the Sinn Féin motion is the issue of the bank veto and the issue of NAMA properties. Somebody would actually have to ask themselves the question, if the banking veto didn't exist in the insolvency legislation, would it be robust enough to stand up to a constitutional challenge? Because loans that are tied to secure debts have property rights to them, and if that veto wasn't there, would we be in a situation that we would have been able to have passed that legislation? Another aspect of the veto that's not being acknowledged is when the banks actually engage with a person in insolvency arrangement and don't use that veto, what it does is it ties in all the unsecured lending that the borrower actually has as well. So credit card debt, credit union debt and other factors. So what we're actually doing in the legislation is ensuring that when somebody gets a write-down on their mortgage, which may be the case on a case-by-case basis, debt that is unsecured is also being reduced and is being looked in the totality of the situation, because it's ridiculous to be just dealing with somebody's mortgage and not looking at the other debt exposure that they actually have. The other item is the matter of NAMA, and that's a very, very simplistic approach in the motion this evening. The difficulty with NAMA properties is that they're not in places where housing demand actually exists in a great number of instances. And what we need to see coming before the House, and which I have debated here with Minister O'Sullivan, has been the proposal of NAMA looking at rent-to-buy programmes. If there are houses in estates around the country that are purchasable, we should be incentivising those houses towards home ownership. And the reason why I say that is that despite the housing crisis that we have been in, Ireland will continue to be a home purchasing nation into the future. In fact, half the residential properties in this country at this moment in time are actually mortgage-free, if you look at the broader context. Though there is a frustration, I think, at both sides of the House with regard to this problem, and I would certainly reflect that frustration, considering the previous administration, when they published the preliminary Cooney report and the full Cooney report afterwards, on both occasions didn't debate the issue inside this House. It was only debated here because of the Labour Party private member's motion that I put down at the time. And what we had during that period was 2 to 3 wasted years where nothing of substance in terms of legislation was passed. And we would be 2 years ahead of the game if the insolvency legislation had actually been designed and we had come into government with insolvency legislation actually in place. But regretfully that didn't happen, and the new government had a job of doing it, and because of that there has been a delay, and we would all share that frustration. But what I now wish to address, Chairperson, is I'd like there is a message that the banks need to receive, and I think Professor Horne last week kind of indicated when he was talking about pulling out the hair of his head. No, I'm not so worried about the hair in Professor Horne's head. I'm more worried about the roof that people actually have over their heads. But there's 2 messages that need to go to the banks, and I think it's something as well that Sinn Féin and other members of the House need to be mindful of. The housing crisis is not a single category problem. There are 3 categories of people that are in that difficulty. There are people who are in short-term distress who need some level of forbearance, and there are people in medium to long-term distress that need more complicated types of forbearances. But there's a 3rd category out there. That forbearance is actually compounding their difficulty and actually making it worse. And for them, the insolvency legislation was designed for. It hasn't been designed for the first 2, and it's disingenuous in members of this House to be confusing insolvency with forbearance. Thank you very much. And I think what's really at the centre of this difficulty here is that the banks themselves are still in denial with regard to property values. I would be very much of the belief that property values as they currently are realistic values. House properties at this time are not undervalued. However, the banks' belief systems with regard to current values will determine how they'll engage with mortgage to rent, it will determine how they'll engage with split mortgages, and it will determine how they engage with other resolution methods. The last thing I would say this evening, Chairperson, is this. What we want in the broadest terms of resolving this problem is a normalised housing residential market, one in which people can afford to buy a home and one in which debt is dealt with at a meaningful level. But ultimately, we have done other measures, such as the house price property tax database, which has led towards normalisation. The central bank has brought in more prudent lending practices that are towards a more normalised housing market. And this issue is something that has to be seen in terms of creating a normalised housing market. Thank you.
Deputy Eamon Maloney. 2 minutes, and I'll let you know when there's 1 to go.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you. I just want to focus on given the time constraints, just on one, what I see as an omission in the private member's bill. And as I say, I'm just going to focus on that. And like the previous speaker, Deputy Lynch, I actually welcome, whether it's from Sinn Féin or anyone else, I think it's a good thing that opposition should continuously highlight this thing, because mortgage debt is for not for all of those who have mortgages. The severity of it affects, in terms of all the mortgages in the country, it's relatively, I don't want to diminish it, relatively small. Those who are in real trouble, and I think we should have to say that, and we should be honest in our debate when we're dealing with this subject. People talk about it in sort of general terms, that everyone who has a mortgage in this country is under siege. That's a lie. They're not. Some people are, and it should be the duty of those of us, irrespective of which side of the House that are elected to this House, to try and do something in terms of legislation to make it easy for them. And my reservation about the one aspect of the amendment, which or the private member's motion, which I've read, is again this sort of blanket thing that everyone who has a mortgage, is an ordinary homeowner. They are not. At the very boom of this housing thing, 2006, there was 120,000 houses built, 120,000 of them. Half of them were built by landlords. And if anyone is suggesting to me that this House or this Parliament should commit to a scheme where they would aid the landlords, and by the way, I'm talking about, if you break down the figures, of all the people we talked about in terms of trouble with their mortgages, almost 20% of them are landlords. And some of them are multi-landlords. And we've listened to a dish of it here. I'm not referring to the Sinn Féin people on this occasion, some of the earlier speakers talking about this. I mean, they're multi-landlords. And we had this spectacle last year of one of the members of the highly technical group out in South Dublin sympathising with somebody who's been put out of their mansion, who of course has transpired on 21 houses. 21 houses. So I didn't come in here to support people who have 21 houses. I come in here to support people who have genuine difficulties with their mortgage. Sorry for going on.
I call now Deputy Tom Barry, please.
I'd just like to contribute on the mortgage distress side, and something I've been involved with for quite a while. I mean, set into the Irish psyche is the need to own your own home, and a desire probably ingrained from famine times, when the Tenant Right League began to demand for the 3 Fs. That was fair rent, fixture of tenure and free sale. The rush of a new generation to buy a family home was all-consuming, and unfortunately has trapped not only this generation of first-time buyers, but also those who sold existing houses to move upwards and onwards. Each group bought according to their disposable income at the time and are now trapped in a financial nightmare. And strangely enough, the solution which should have worked in 1847 with the 3 Fs might work here. And it relates to split mortgages or to part percentage on a mortgage. Fair rent equates to a fair payment what the mortgage payer can pay, principal and interest. Fixture of tenure is that as long as the person can actually pay what they've agreed to pay, that they will not be evicted. And thirdly, that they can sell their house with whatever tie-in it has on it. It's very, very important for us to remember here that this must be pursued. And I know the banks are doing it, and I'm dealing with them a lot on it, but they're only getting through 1,500 cases a month. We need to give the resources to make sure that we can get to each individual case of distress, because the fear of losing one's home is all-consuming.
Yes.
Thank you. It's all-consuming. And we must get to a point where we deal with each person specifically on their own case. This situation will not go away, and no decision is just kicking the can down the road. Yes, there'll probably have to be debt write-down in some cases. In other cases, possibly we can look at stretching it out over periods of time that will allow them the possibility of paying. But either way, we have to grasp it and we have to work on it. And in fairness to the banks, they're coming in and they are engaging with us. And, you know, our Irish pillar banks are doing an awful lot better than some of the foreign banks, and that has to be credited. But the skills of dealing with this crisis, and I appreciate it being brought up because it is, to me, one of the largest crises we're facing. And until we get this right, we will not be out of trouble. And I think we'll be judged as a government on how we deal with people fairly and equitably.
Thank you, Deputy. Call now Deputy Dan Neville. You have 3 minutes.
I welcome an opportunity to contribute to the debate, and I just want to highlight the link between those who are in serious difficulty with mortgage, those who are in serious debt, and the link between that and mental health. There is now identified a situation which is known as debt depression, which is a growing concern, and is called, especially for mental health training, for banking and debt collecting staff, those who deal with those who are who have to deal with bank officials, and some of the banks are making efforts to work on this. But I suppose for the neglect over time, progress is very slow in relation to having bank staff properly understand the difficulties, the pressure, the hopelessness, the despair that many people who have mortgage difficulties, because we know that is extremely stressful, depressing, that somebody who loses a home or who is in fear of losing a home, that this creates extreme stress amongst the people involved, especially if they also have the stress of after losing a job, losing their self-esteem. Difficulties arise within the family, because of the changed circumstances. Pressure comes on families, comes on relationships, and no matter how much the parents will protect the children, it's impossible to do so, because the vibes, the difficulties, the stresses, the inevitable stress on the relationships is present. This often leads to people in such situations taking solace in alcohol and drug abuse, and unfortunately we have seen so many who go into deeper depression, and unfortunately some have taken their lives. And let's identify as well that a year ago 30 developers have taken their lives because of the difficulties they experience. So, you can be very flippant, and rightly so, and criticise somebody, but the level of serious mental distress, mental difficulties that people experience from the point of view of death, depression, is quite serious and should be recognised. And I think that it is important that bank staff agencies and debt collection agency staff should have a great awareness and training in how to identify and deal with those situations and be able to respond to them. They should, there are, in relation to poverty, and, I've had people coming to me who had very successful lives, who had a very good job, who had a very nice house, very good house in a very good area, who the only thing they wanted was a medical card, because they couldn't pay their debts, they couldn't, their lifestyle was gone. Their wife, one in particular, she was down out a 3-day week. He was drawing unemployment, all senior executives. Now, just because somebody might have a strange lifestyle, this depressive situation regarding to mortgages goes across all sections of society as we relate to it. So while I'm just saying that let's recognise what debt depression is and how it's utterly necessary to have people who are dealing with those in crisis with their mortgages and other debts are trained to understand, identify and respond to what's being placed in front of them.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Call now Deputy Sean Kine. You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. I might need 4 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. I think it goes without saying that unsustainable over-indebtedness is one of the most significant problems facing us today, and the one characteristic which has exacerbated this recession is the high level of personal debt which many people have. And there is, I suppose, an observation, a very human trait in many of us, in ignoring a problem until it goes away, in the futile hope that it will go away, whether it be a health issue, a work-related issue, a relationship issue, or in this case a financial issue. And from experience, however, it's clear that problems rarely go away or sort themselves out. Instead they grow, they fester and they worsen. Unfortunately, this approach was the one adopted by previous governments in relation to the mortgage arrears crisis. Anyone who suggested that Ireland may have a problem with over-indebtedness was ignored or rebuked as a doomed merchant, and anyone who raised concerns about an unsustainable property bubble was shouted down with false assurances of a soft landing ahead. And this ignorance and indeed arrogance left the state in a much weaker position and ill-equipped to deal with the problem ahead of us and the problems of over-indebtedness. When the recession's grip took hold, it wasn't long before the realisation suddenly dawned that a Victorian-era personal debt system was of little use or benefit in the 21st century Ireland. Since election to this House, I've obviously come into much greater contact with the legislative system and the lawmaking process, the Oireachtas standing orders and procedures and everything else. None has been designed for quick, speedy solutions. In fact, the legislative process can be frustratingly slow, and no more so for the citizens in need. And one of the most demanding challenges can be that of trying to implement change while ensuring that a system keeps functioning. However, there is no excuse for the absence of any meaningful personal insolvency legislative reform over the last decade or more. The ideal time to reform systems, such as the social welfare system, for example, or legislation, is when demand is low. But I suspect there's little to be gained from dwelling on this oversight now. The Oireachtas, of course, must learn from this, and I believe that the Government and Minister Shatter are providing this lead, by example, with a radical new personal insolvency bill. And I believe the personal insolvency bill, coupled with a new, focused, fair approach by the financial institutions, all of whom owe their existence to the Irish citizens, represents a hugely important step in addressing the mortgage arrears problem. Specifically with mortgage-related debt, the new personal insolvency arrangements will be of great benefit in tackling unsustainable debt outside the court system. It's a less judicially focused system and will, I'm certain, prove to be a more consensus-based alternative to bankruptcy. Minister, when you were previously at a committee, I made a suggestion regarding a relatively easy to implement system in terms of transfer of NAMA stock in lieu of unpaid development levies to try and get a social dividend for our local authorities.
1 minute.
And I know you said at the time you'd look at it, and you might dwell further on that. If you could, I believe it would enable local authorities to work through housing lists much more quickly and avoid one of the worst social problems, homelessness, by providing a home to those who need it. I think when NAMA was formed first, and you know, as a local authority member at the time, I thought there would be a certain a bonus to local authorities in terms of land banks or unfinished estates or whatever being transferred to sort out problems of social housing, which exists in so many areas. In my own area, where due to the cost of housing and the value of land, local authorities have been unable to access and afford building land to provide social housing for those in need. So I would have had hoped at the time, and it's still hope, that this can be looked at, and I would again ask that suggestion be taken up by you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. I now call on Deputy Sandra McClellan. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's one to go.
Okay. The Swiss architect Le Corbusier famously once described a house as a machine for living in. The machine metaphor and the capitalist undertones embedded within it provide a clue to what can happen when the machine itself becomes the perceived source of financial power, speculation and class status. When this happens, a clear disjuncture emerges between the house as a machine and the notion of the house as a place in which we engage in the art of living. Since the foundation of the Irish state, successive governments have fostered and supported, through policies and financial inducements, private home ownership. That this would be the case was not, however, a foregone conclusion. The new state, in choosing the so-called free market as the dominant reference point for housing, rejected the Sinn Féin democratic programme, which was the socially progressive blueprint of the independence project. Instead, the state's approach to housing is characterised in economic terms by austerity and fiscal rectitude, and in ideological terms by a conservative nationalism that was both elitist and anti-urban. Thus, from the 1930s on, we see a series of government policies and initiatives which give primacy to home ownership. The state reaffirms this commitment when, in Article 42 of the 1937 Constitution, it copper fastens into law the special place of private property. In this sense, the early work of building the nation is deeply entwined with the values associated with private ownership. Put another way, possession or ownership becomes equated with citizenship, or at the very least, in the state's eyes, with the good or model citizen. In this vision, the urban and rural working class are relegated to second-class status and deliberately excluded through government policy from the material benefits of the state by the state. Thus, from the 1930s on, we see a process whereby successive governments subsidise private builders with public money in order to make private housing affordable for the new middle classes. In this scenario, private home ownership becomes synonymous with status, respectability and moral character. Conversely, public housing is associated with social inferiority, low socio-economic status and the working classes. Put another way, in terms of employment, education, status and life chances, consignment to the local authority sector was the gateway out of society, not the passport in. Right across urban Ireland, we see the spatial manifestation of this inferiority in post-war public housing estates of Dublin, Limerick and Cork. The state's decision to sell off a significant portion of the public housing stock in the early 1970s has its origins in this state-centred middle-class bias. As a direct result of this policy, the public housing stock is seriously depleted, and public housing is now seen as the cause of poor quality of life for its tenants, rather than as a guarantor of the security from it. Thus, during the so-called boom years, when a house became a commodity to be traded with the aim of making a profit, Private housing wealth, housing poverty and affluence existed side by side, and we had, to paraphrase J.K. Galbraith, the existence of public squalor amid private affluence. Today we are faced with a situation where there are almost 100,000 people on the housing waiting list and another 94,000 people who are in receipt in rent supplement at a cost to the state of almost €500 million. Thousands more are condemned to a life in hostels, shelters and B&Bs. To add to this, household financial stress is at unprecedented levels, as seen in the extraordinary rate of arrears in owner-occupied mortgages. These figures, taken together, are shocking. However, if we just cast our eyes in the doorways and laneways within minutes of this House, we see homeless women and men, most of them young, that are testament to the failed policies of this and previous governments. In the final analysis, a state that cannot house its own people is a failed state. Even worse, a state that refuses to recognise that housing is a social utility and not a commodity, that it is a fundamental part of the socialisation process, is also a failed state. However, unlike the parties of the right, Sinn Féin believes now, as we did back in the days of the democratic programme, that the state has a responsibility to house all of its people. We believe that all housing, be it public or private, is essentially social, and that housing should never be viewed or used as a commodity for profit.
Thank you, Deputy. I call now on Deputy Padraig McLaughlin. 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when there's 2 to go.
Thanks, Chairman. Of course, it's ironic that you're chairing this session, being one of the people who's warned about the huge challenge of private debt, of mortgage debt in this state, and you've evangelised about this issue for a long time now.
Chair.
Absolutely. In relation to the first part of this, housing, I think any layperson looks at all of this in bewilderment. We had a situation where not so long ago we were buying turnkey housing developments, full housing developments at full market value, and doing that right across the state. And now, of course, we know that houses across the state have halved in value. So that simple rule of thumb in economics, that at a time of recession, that's the time where the government should intervene. A, because it creates jobs. B, because you get the best possible deal for the taxpayer. And C, because it prepares your economy for the turnaround. We clearly should be buying houses now at this stage and purchasing all those empty ghost estates for social housing across the state, because they're coming in at half the price they would have been years gone by, but we're not doing that. What we are doing is going for 10-year leases, and so we're not dealing, we're going for 10-year leases. We're getting a crazy economic proposition for the taxpayer in all of this, and that's because of the overall absence of a strategy. Sinn Féin has said repeatedly we could look at the National Pension Reserve Fund, twin with the European Investment Bank potential, and of course private pension funds. Not just us have said this, of course you have ICTU, and Sinn Féin talks about a 13 billion stimulus package over 4 years, and of course one key area would be social housing. You see, there are solutions if we're brave enough and imaginative to look at them. 100,000 people on the list at this stage, a real crisis. Moving on to the next issue, is that one of the deputies who just spoke says that it's only a small amount of people affected by this mortgage distress. That's an incredible statement for a deputy to make. 1 in 4 mortgage holders are in distress. That's 168,000 households approximately. Now, if you just took one representative from each of those households, not the entire family, just one representative, that fills Croke Park twice. That's the scale of this crisis. Any deputy who has their finger on the pulse, who listens to their communities, who's in their constituency offices, knows this is a crisis. I can tell you, I could stand here for the next 2 hours talking about conversations that I've had with families in Donegal, people who are ringing you late at night in total dismay and distress, asking, should I hand the keys of the house over? Should I do that? Impossible situations put to you. And think about this. These were just ordinary 5/8, just like me. no experts in the economy a number of years ago, and we believed the economists. We believed our politicians at that time. We believed all the hype in the newspapers. You couldn't open a newspaper without seeing a property supplement and, you know, soft landings and prices can only go up and buy now while prices are at this level. You'd be crazy not to. That's what people bought into. They were totally betrayed, and they've remained betrayed because there's no solution. Which moves me into my final comments. The personal insolvency bill. I sat through, I would say, by the end up possibly 17 or 18 hours of debate, you know, in terms of the committee stage and here in the Dáil. And on the final night we discussed it, something very symbolic happened. We had the so-called public interest director, Ray McSharry, with the permanent TSB, telling my colleague here, Deputy Pearse Doherty, there'll be no write-downs. This is the public interest director telling us there'll be no write-downs. Absolutely not going to happen. And then we have Patrick Honohan telling us that he's tearing his hair out because the banks will not go after this debt. I mean, seriously, like, people at home must be totally bewildered. All of the tens of billions that we've put into these banks, and today we have AIB saying they're going to increase their variable rate. We own it 100%, and people are just totally bewildered that there's been a solution for all of the bondholders, all of the extremely wealthy gamblers who were so reckless, but our people have been betrayed here in the state. 1 in 4 mortgage holders. It is an absolute fundamental crisis, and it needs to be addressed in a very, very focused, urgent and determined fashion.
Thank you.
And hopefully our motion, which is full of solutions, not just identifying the problem, we always come forward with solutions. At some point, somebody needs to listen and somebody needs to realise that the Emperor is wearing no clothes.
Thank you. Deputy Jerry Adams.
Minister, the government, as we've just heard, is feeling the tens of thousands of families in mortgage distress and on social housing waiting lists. And last October, Fiona Muldoon, the head of the banking regulation at the Irish Central Bank, was scathing in her criticism of the bankers and their failure to address the issue of mortgage distress. This morning, the AIB indicated that they plan to increase their variable interest rates once again, and that will directly impact on 70,000 customers. And as you well know, 1.25% rise in rates adds £30 a month, €30 a month to the cost of repayments on every 200,000 borrowed. And that's €30 that many of these families simply don't have. The AIB is also a fully owned state bank, and the government is refusing to deal with this issue in the way that it should. So it seems to be it's okay to give £64 billion of the taxpayers' money to the banks, but it's not an issue to help citizens in mortgage distress. Sinn Féin's view is that the government should intervene directly and tell AIB that their planned rates increase is not acceptable. Now, Fine Gael and Labour came to power promising to prioritise those in mortgage distress. Instead, it has abandoned them. By complete coincidence, on this very day, 2 years ago, Labour told people in mortgage distress, if Labour is in government, they will enjoy peace of mind. And the Labour Party leader, Eamon Gilmore, said, the banks have already received thousands of millions in taxpayers' money. There has to be a quid pro quo for that, and that is to give people who are in mortgage distress a breather. I didn't make that up. That's what the party leader and the Taoiseach of today said. Yet another broken promise. And today there are more citizens than ever. 2 years on, more than ever. There are 180,000 households currently in trouble, with 115 additional homeowners falling into distress every day. And I often wonder to myself, what exactly is the point of the Labour Party in this day, and particularly of the Labour Party in government, particularly this government and this government's record? So the personal insolvency legislation will not fix this problem. It gives the banks a veto over the arrangements, and as long as they have a veto, why would they not exercise it? If you give it to them, they'll use it to their own and in their own self-interest. So I want to deal, if I may, just briefly, Cathaoirleach, with the issue of social housing. The policy of the government in depleting the social housing stock is exacerbating the crisis in housing and a number of citizens on waiting lists. In my constituency office, and I'm sure it's the same for every TD, is dealing with increasing numbers of people who have been forced to leave what was the family home. Sometimes this is because of domestic breakdown, sometimes it's due to domestic violence and relationship been coming to an end. And then these citizens have difficulty, Gura Margaret, assessing supplementary welfare allowance or rental allowance because they're often deemed by the local authority housing lists to have vested financial interest in family homes which they no longer occupy. And you're bound to have dealt with this yourself in your long involvement in politics. There's a lack of clarity in this area and a disparity in procedures between local authorities. And Minister Hogan needs to empower and resource local authorities to effectively assess such applicants. He needs to set out a clear policy to deal with these matters, to establish mechanisms to allow for compassionate and psychological factors to be part of the assessment process. And finally, Catherine, in a republic, in a real republic, citizens should have the right to a home. But this isn't, as we learn every day, a real republic. It is, as was said by a historian many years ago, a dictionary republic. But a Labour Party, was its name, should aspire to protecting citizens, safeguarding their rights and ensuring that they have a home. And this motion proposes measures that can very definitively contribute to ending the current crisis in housing, and I commend it to the Dáil.
Thank you, Deputy. Call now on Deputy Sean Crowe. You have 5 minutes. I'll let you know when there's 2 remaining.
Thanks very much. I suppose there's just general agreement in here right across all the parties in relation to there's a difficulty out there. There is a crisis there in relation to housing. The extent of that crisis, I think there's probably differences in relation to it. But all I can say is that every day in the constituency office that I have, that people come in relation to, the majority of cases in relation to housing. Many of them are in relation to people are in distress in relation to their mortgages. I suppose what they're coming in is looking for advice. They're looking for solutions. The general consensus is right across the board is that whatever supports are there is not working for them. So they're coming to us and pleading with us, how am I going to save my home being lost or whatever else? And they're up to their nines in relation, they're worried sick in relation to it. People are talking about not being able to sleep at night and so on. The other problems people come in relation to, it's social housing. Again, what's happening locally in my area is that the list is getting longer. If that person loses their home, has to give it back, there's a waiting list in relation to see the housing office to get on the list, and then you're talking about possibly waiting up to 6 years. I suppose one of the obscene things in relation to all this, like the madness that went on in relation to development and so on, is that we have a lot of accommodation right across the state and in NAM and so on, and yet we have people on these housing lists. There's not the same extent. There's not the, we don't have the ghost estates in our area. There is accommodation there. I don't know if it would be suitable certainly for family accommodation, but it would be suitable for students, for nursing for the local hospital and so on. So there's a lot of people there that need accommodation that can't get it at the moment. I think it's obscene that accommodation just lying there and no one using it. And that's what people can't understand in relation to it. Now, a lot of people in here, again, they would rubbish, and particularly those journalists outside, would rubbish the fact that when people would call for a housing programme, that we'd actually start building housing. But there's a need for that in this city. There's a need for local accommodation, and I think there's a need for a rollout of the social housing. We know ourselves that the housing stock has shrunk in relation to it. So it's right across the board in relation to the Dublin area. So we have put across solutions here. We're talking in terms of those, include the possibility of write-downs and partial mortgage debt, as well as other options. Take more directional actions with the central bank to force lending institutions to adopt a more proactive and lender-friendly approach to the mortgage crisis. Ensure that NAMA contributes to social and economic development of the state in providing more housing units in its portfolio suitable for social housing. and again to develop a plan to commence the building of at least 5,000 units by the end of 2013. With a further 4,000 by the second half of 2014. And again, it ticks all the boxes. It gives someone accommodation, it creates employment, but it's also about those people, giving people a basic right. Deputy Abbas is right in relation to, surely one of the basic tenets of a republic should be that someone should have access to a roof over their heads. And we know to our cost, we just walk outside the door here, the amount of people that are in that situation where they feel that there's nowhere safe for them to go, and many of them are homeless in relation to it. So it's a genuine attempt to address this problem that's facing us all as a society. And lastly, I just think it's crazy what we're doing at the moment. People are critical of what we're doing with speculators and so on, but we're, instead of actually giving people their own home through the social housing scheme, what we're doing is we're putting in more money and more money into private landlords. And again, the lack of inspection in relation to that accommodation.